for everyone being here. It's fortunate that we have so many people in the audience that know so much about what I'm going to talk about today. So my presentation, let me pull this up, has to do, this entire class has to do with China-Africa relations and economic relations. And I wanted to talk about something that has largely been, I think, overlooked in this colloquium series, which is the informal economy in Africa. Now, I'm going to present this almost as a debate against formalizing the informal economy, so please keep that in mind as I go through this. And most of the information that I get comes from the International Labor Organization. They've come out with a few books that have been published in the past couple years, so that's where most of the statistics come from. So the informal economy, or as the Beatles say, let it be. That is my argument for it. So first of all, where is the informal economy? I'm sure most of you can answer that question, but it's all around us. The informal economy is everywhere. It is found on every nation on this planet. If you're in Mumbai, if you're in Memphis, Tennessee, if you're in Los Angeles, if you're in Lagos, you're going to see the informal economy, maybe not as visibly in some places as others, but it is there. And right now, the informal economy accounts for over half of the global employment in the world. It's a massive number. In many developing countries, the informal economy accounts for more than 90% of the total labor force. I believe the UN estimates that 1.8 billion people work in the informal economy compared to 1.2 billion that work in the formal economy. So we're seeing a shift in the economies, and there's a lot of reasons for that I hope to go over today. While so many people assume that the informal economy is synonymous with the global south, or just the developing world, that's not necessarily true. Many OECD countries have significant informal economies as well. The World Bank estimates that the gross national income of the informal economy in developing countries is 41%. In transition countries, it's as high as 38%. And in OECD countries, it's as high as 18%. In fact, a recent report of the United States says that for every $10 spent, $1 here is going to the informal economy. And in Los Angeles, that is as much as a quarter of that. So 25% is an informal economy in the city of Los Angeles right now. So although the informal economy is ubiquitous, even in the global north, the focus of our the focus of my talk is going to be on the global south and specifically sub-Saharan Africa. And so what I want to talk about is what makes the informal economy. And please understand, I will not be talking about black market. I will not be talking about criminal or tax evasive strategies. That is not the informal economy that is part of this. What I will be talking about is how employees are considered to have informal jobs. Sorry, I'm a little bit behind that. Employees are, by the International Labor Organization, employees are considered to have informal jobs if their employment relationship in law or in practice is not subject to income taxation, social protection, and entitlement to certain benefits. That's really what makes the informal economy, that benefit part, and not being legible to formal government. But this definition can also be extended to defined enterprises, which I'm sure a lot of our friends here today can explain in the agricultural sectors, especially in the global south. In other words, the lack of recognition is basically the basic criterion for definition of informality. And traditionally, this has been thought of as subsistence farmers, but you can see the informal economy increasing in urban centers all over the world. So if you go to any city in the global south, you're going to be confronted with the street vendors, transporters, artisans, healers, all of these individuals and micro enterprises that fall within what we call the informal economy. And this urban informal economy is growing at a rapid rate. For example, estimates regarding non-agricultural informality are staggering. So in Southern and Southeast Asia, informal employment, excluding agriculture, is as high as 70% of the region's total employment. And in sub-Saharan Africa, non-agricultural informal employment is up to 70%. So it's a very, very large number, and it's also adding a lot of value to these economies. It's not just that people aren't working in the formal sector, it's that gross value added in a lot of these countries is as much as half. In India, it's 46% of gross value added is their informal economy. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's as much as 50%. So there's significant value in the informal economy, which is something that we want to consider as we go forward. So even though this is staggering, I want to talk about why we should not, the size of the informal economy is staggering. I want to talk about how we should hold off on the formalization efforts currently, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. But to do that, we got to do away with false dichotomies. So the dichotomies that I'm talking about are this idea that the informal sector has been traditionally viewed with these characteristics. So this is kind of the traditional way that scholars have looked at the informal sector, with low entry requirements, small scale of operations, unskilled labor, labor-intensive methods of production, families owning the enterprises, a very unregulated market, low productivity, minimal saving. A lot of people say that there's very little innovation because it's a survival area of economies. I'm going to confront that today by arguing that the informal economy exists on a continuum. So what we're starting to see is that the way that we perceive economies, it's a continuous process. The informal economy is counter-cyclical, and that it increases when the national economy decelerates and contracts when the economic rate of growth increases. Now, in the past, that was always viewed as if GDP is going up, the informal economy is going down, therefore informal economy is bad. But we're starting to see that the informal economy might be playing a very big role in why GDP is going up in certain countries. So going back to this idea of a continuum, if we have the informal sector and we have a spectrum from informal to formal, innovation is essentially what is driving that. That's the mechanism that I believe policymakers should be focused on, especially in Africa, because it can become an asset rather than something that's holding back development. So, like Chami says at the bottom, that's from the the International Institute of Economic Development. There is a gradual transition from informal to formal enterprise status. So we see this essentially, to give you some examples of this happening, especially during the recession, this happened all over the world. In Peru, for instance, formal construction workers that were essentially put out of job because construction was put at a standstill would suddenly start moving into the informal sector, selling goods at night, trying to engage in things so their family doesn't fall into poverty. In Kenya, informal dairy farmers are selling their products to formalized supermarkets. So there's a cooperation there. And households can feature both informal and formal economies, for example. I was in Kenya, and there was a household where the husband was working for the State Department, whereas his wife was a very talented entrepreneur. She had her own honey business out in the rural areas where she was selling honey, and she also had just helped build an apartment complex and now was the landlord of that apartment complex and was doing that. So you see in just one household, the formal economy and the informal economy working together. The reason the informal sector can exist on the continuum, again, is because of this idea of innovate. Now, when I say innovation, I don't mean research and development. Like, that's what we think of Silicon Valley here in the U.S. It's like that's, innovation or NASA or some type of state-funded thing to figure things out. What I mean by innovation is, in developing countries, is, and I'm going to quote here, it's more of a way to improve people's lives by transforming knowledge into new or improved ways of doing things in a place where or by people for whom they have not been used before. So it's a looser definition of innovation, but I think it's an important perspective that we got to hold on to. And to talk about this a little bit more, I'm going to go over 2 case studies for you. So the first case study brings us to Nairobi. I'm going to talk about informal metal workers in Kamakunji. They are some of the best metal workers, I'd say, in East Africa. They sell their products all over East Africa, but not only to other people in informal settlements. They sell them all over the country. Some of these metal products have reached hotels in Europe and things like that. I mean, these are artisans, and they're doing some great work. So in Kenya especially, the informal sector is a vital job creation engine. The Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics estimates that the informal sector contributes to 90% of the new jobs each year. I mean, that is a massive number. And in Nairobi, the informal economy has been found to cluster geographically, especially in informal settlements. So these clusters are essentially hotspots of innovation. People that are working with metal want to go to people that have been working with metal. There's an apprenticeship structure there, and these masters are teaching people the tools of the trade, and these sectors start to grow in these areas geographically, and they become known. It becomes like a brand. If you want to go and get some great metalwork, you go to Kamakunji outside of Nairobi. Informal metalwork has been everywhere, and this idea of an informal worker actually in Kenya is a very endearing term. It's this term called jua kali, which means working under the hot sun. So there's a funny story in 1971 when they first kind of dubbed the informal sector. There was this big meeting of the mines, I guess, with people from all over the world, and they were talking at the time about moonlighting. So again, this idea of like a black market, like kind of hidden. And the representative from Kenya stood up and he said, none of our citizens work under the moon. They work under the sun. You know, our term for it is jua kali. There's a hot sun. So they were going for. So that idea is in Kenya, to be an informal worker is actually it's not something that's looked down upon. You know, and specifically, craftspeople are known as fundi. Which is another term that implies that you have some technical skill and expertise in this area. And so the products, excuse me, in the Kamakunji include cooking pots, stoves, pans, wheelbarrows, metal boxes, and they're sold everywhere. And the history of this dates back before independence in 1963. This area where Kamakunji is located is very close to a bus station, the Machakos bus station. And what's interesting about that is, even though this is in the informal sector and an informal settlement, access to that transportation or access to that infrastructure has allowed those goods to proliferate all over Kenya. It's a big part of why this area of the informal economy has been able to grow. In 1984, President Moi visited Kamakunji, and he was so impressed by the workers and what they do that he promised shades for the jua kali. And he actually made good on that promise. He came back and he built these large canopies and shades that still exist today. And what's very interesting is because this informal sector has been allowed to just grow and proliferate, it has started to formalize. Surprise, surprise, right? In 1984, the Kamakunji Jua Kali Association was unofficially founded, and it currently has 4,000 members. It has a population in the cluster that exceeds 5,000 artisans, business owners, suppliers, brokers, service providers. So it's a very large part of that economy right there. And what's interesting is most of these metalworkers did well. The old ideas of working in the informal sector and economy as being stuck in a poverty trap are not true in this regard. 68% earn sales that exceed the national income average in Kenya. So they're doing well, and it's a way out of poverty for many of them. One of the most interesting ideas in Kamakunji is this idea of sharing knowledge. So in America especially, like if you want to innovate, first thing you do is go to a patent office. You know, like you don't want anyone stealing your idea. It's like, that's mine. Here, only 20%, there was a survey done, only 20% of the workers surveyed actually believe that they own the right to their idea, which is a staggering number for an American especially. And extremely talented Jua Kali would still work with their shades open. It's actually an unofficial rule in the cluster that you have to have your shades open while you're working so other workers can see what you're doing. You know, and again, it's a very un-American idea, I would say, but it allows innovation to proliferate. It allows this informal sector to grow. And if you were to formalize it, if you were to formalize and patent ideas and have people like now make it illegal to copy a certain thing, what would that do to that economy? You know, so we have to think about that as policymakers going forward. So that's a cautionary tale. The other thing that we have to remember with this case study is that access to infrastructure, like transportation, allowed this small-scale upgrading to occur. And you see over the years why it's now a very viable thing. And then the greatest threat to this is really the importation of cheap goods. So that kind of ties back into this idea of China-Africa relations, where there's a lot of countries in Africa that are getting an influx of cheap goods from China. What is that doing to the informal sector and to these workers? And that's another thing where tariffs can help protect them. So finally, I'll move over to Ghana. This is a short case study where we don't often think of traditional medicine as being a driver of the economy, but in Ghana, it's very much a part of their medical practices. 70% of Ghanaian people use traditional healers. It's actually been it's been monitored by the World Health Organization for over 20 years, and they're seeing that Ghana has significantly better healthcare or population health than similar countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And these traditional medical healers are considered to be a big part of that. Ghana in 2010, actually in their master plans for the economy, included traditional medical practitioners in those plans. It's another example of the informal economy serving a public good, providing a public good, and something that should be taken seriously and not thrown aside when we try to formalize things. So this idea of the informal economy being a hidden engine of innovation is pretty much what I want to kind of hammer home with this idea. Sorry, my notes have just moved. So as Kramer puts it, disregarding the role of such innovation in developing countries produces misleading, asymmetrical, or ineffective innovation strategies. And acknowledging innovation strategies in the informal sector are becoming increasingly abundant. So what I have up here is these words that are starting to proliferate. If you read The Economist, the New York Times, anything that is having stuff that involves journalists about the informal economy, you're seeing grassroots, base of the pyramid, inclusive, frugal. These words are starting to grow because people are starting to see the value in the informal sector. This proliferation of labels speaks to a wider phenomenon. And one of these phenomenons is that the market is starting to see the value in the informal sector. So this is something from The Economist that they were talking about in a recent article, where this idea of bottom of the pyramid, which is essentially 4 billion people on this planet that are making less than $1,500 per year, are now being viewed as a multi-trillion-dollar market, so much so that corporations are trying to figure out how to frugalize. So corporations are trying to figure out how to produce goods like they were in the informal economy so that they can sell to these people. And the way I look at that as a person, as a planner, is I say, well, the informal economy is already there. You have entrepreneurs and people in these economies that can already deliver these goods to people, and this is a market that's only going to grow. So rather than taking them out of that market through the process of formalization, allow them to use the market and grow their businesses in it. So the Institute of Economic Development says the informal economy everywhere is on the rise. Main reason for this is growth appears to be that formal labor markets have not been able to generate sufficient jobs to absorb a continuously growing workforce, particularly for unskilled labor. Why is it so important to absorb labor? Well, I'm sure everyone knows that we're moving towards massive urbanization all over the world. The UN points out that in 2050, 66% of the world's population will live in urban centers. And with more than 70% of Africa's urban population living in slums or informal settlements. In the global south, large numbers of people are moving from rural areas to the city, and so you need a mechanism that can absorb this massive migration. It's not changing. There's this old story of a king that said he was so powerful he could stop the tide, and he put his chair out there, and the tide came in, and he got his feet wet. I feel like a lot of policymakers are essentially saying that, well, we're just going to stop rural migration, or we're going to stop this process of urbanization. It's not going anywhere. And so we need to think creatively of how we can take in a massive surge of urbanization without putting people in poverty traps, but having these slums grow exponentially and that people can't get out of. So again, the formal sector cannot provide, as of right now, the formal sector in many of these sub-Saharan African countries cannot provide the income, jobs, and public services needed. So the formal sector needs to figure out a way to work in tandem with the informal economy. And so my conclusion is that we've argued the informal economy is an essential economic pillar in the developing world. It's innovative, adaptive, able to absorb uncertainties for tomorrow. Harnessing this potential requires a shift in perspective. I think that's the key thing. If we shift our perspective of how we view the informal economy, we can shift our policies and actually harness the power that's there rather than exploiting it. States would be wise to work with the informal economy at crafting policies and actions that preclude the possibility of formalization. And I'll end with an Oscar Wilde quote. What is a cynic? A man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.